to ancient Egyptian myth, Osiris, god of the underworld, was once a human. Some people argue that this is just a myth. However, archaeologists have proven that this is true. Artifacts have clearly shown us that Osiris was in fact once a human being and then he died and was granted the power to become a god. In the writings of the ancient priest Manetho, gods were the first rulers of Egypt. In Heliopolis, the creator god, a tomb was worshipped. He was thought to be a descendant of Ptah, the creator of the separation of heaven and earth. Atum was considered the father of the gods who created the first couple, Shu and Tefnut, his children. Shu was air and Tefnut was moisture. Shu and Tefnut married and took their father's rule. As this couple grew older, they had children as well, Nut the sky and Geb the earth. They too married. Then after Shu's rule, Geb became ruler of Egypt and Nut gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. According to ancient Egyptian legend, Osiris, the firstborn of Nut and Geb, ruled on earth. Heliopoean theology tells us about the creation of the gods and of how Osiris came to be a human being. Archaeologists have been able to locate at least 5 different sources that imply that Osiris was once a human king. These sources include 1. The narrative of Plutarch, 2. Funerary texts, 3. Coffin texts, 4. The Book of the Dead, and 5. The discovered burial chamber found by Zawi Hawass. Being the most detailed and most fully preserved account for the myth of Osiris, the narrative of Plutarch is what has given us such a great amount of information regarding this myth. Even though Egyptologists are a bit weary of this narrative, it is still a significant finding that provides evidence that Osiris was indeed a human being. This narrative is what the Egyptologists look back to for information about when Osiris was actually alive. Many of the other sources do not specifically state what Osiris was like and what happened to him as a human. Plutarch's narrative may be the only source that clearly explains Osiris's life on earth before he died. Knowing that this may be the only source for that, historians use this narrative as a reference and try to find what this narrative says in hieroglyphics and other places in Egypt. Plutarch begins by explaining that at the time of Osiris's birth, a loud voice was heard all over the world saying, "The Lord of all the earth is born." This quote certainly indicates that Osiris was indeed born, although it does not directly say he was born into a human, but we can certainly imply that it means just that. The entire narrative of Plutarch describes what Osiris did when he was ruler of Egypt. It never does state that he was a human, but all of the statements in this narrative make logical sense to assume that he was. How can someone describe the acts of another person if they haven't even seen it? Plutarch explained how Osiris directly affected people on earth. Plutarch also explains how Set managed to get Osiris into a sarcophagus that was, by coincidence, perfectly fit for his height. He then locked the lid shut and threw him into the Nile River. This situation cannot be taken in any other way. There does not seem to be any kind of symbolic meaning to this murder of Osiris. Another reason why this seems to be true is that the Nile River is said to be sacred because it is the water of Osiris, who personally brought life to agriculture when he was the king of Egypt. But after being drowned, the Nile River became sacred because that was considered to be part of Osiris. The water from the river made the crops grow, and that is why the crops flourish, because of the water of Osiris. Another part of the story that certainly implies that Osiris was a human is the fact that Osiris has many temples in Egypt. What I mean by this is that whenever Isis found a body part of Osiris, it is said that she buried every part. This would certainly explain why all over Egypt there are several ritual places for Osiris. Another source that we have is the pyramid texts. It was the identification in the pyramid texts that supply us with scattered allusions about Osiris's fate, and especially his relationships with the deceased pharaohs, that triggered the idea of Osiris once being a human king. The pyramid texts show us numerous times that Osiris was once a human being. Many of the hymns explained how Osiris was granted access onto earth. Hymn 1 clearly states that Nut was the mother of Osiris. Nowhere in the text is there any explicit indication that his birth is human. References are to birth by Nut, the female god who represents the sky. In fact, explicit remarks are made otherwise. These hymns show that the ancient Egyptians were reluctant to accept the idea that Osiris was born as a man from an earthly womb. They reserved his birth to an extraterrestrial father and a heavenly mother. We know he must have been born on earth in human form Otherwise, how could he exist as a human being? If he did not have natural human birth, he must have been created in human form on earth by the gods. Utterance 577 clearly shows how Osiris was an earthly human and how the gods have chosen him to live forever, therefore becoming god of the afterlife. Another source that we have is the coffin text. If it were not for Osiris, mummification would not have happened. Almost all of the customs associated with the mummification process were because of Osiris. All of the techniques and ways that this process takes place happened exactly to Osiris when he died. The mummification process continued to be that way because it meant eternal life. If one was not mummified exactly the way Osiris was, then that meant they would not have eternal life and therefore no eternal happiness. So the reason for the coffin text as well as the pyramid text were to assure that people would make it to Osiris, that they would make it to the netherworld. The texts in the pyramids and coffins provided spells against the evil powers. Without these texts, people would not make it to the afterlife or to Osiris to confess their sins. So as you can see, the only purpose for these texts is because of Osiris. Getting to Osiris meant eternal life, which was a very important part of the Egyptian culture. The text provided security of the body while traveling to the netherworld. Examples of how the coffin texts were important are not necessary, because it is clear that the only point for these texts were for the purpose of reaching Osiris. The Book of the Dead consists of chapters that appear in the Egyptian tombs around 1600 BC. This book can be thought of as the deceased guidebook to a happy afterlife. The text was intended to be read by the deceased during their journey into the underworld. It enabled the deceased to overcome obstacles and to not lose their way. It did this by teaching passwords, giving clues, and revealing routes that would allow the deceased to answer questions and navigate around hazards. It would grant the help and protection of the gods while proclaiming the deceased's identity with the gods. Spells from the Book of the Dead are sometimes written on the walls of the pyramids, but more often written on the linen of the mummies. They could also have been written on papyrus and put into the coffin with the mummy. These spells were influenced by and developed after the pyramid and coffin texts. The spells were originally designated by the Egyptians as the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, expressing the freedom granted to the spirit forms to come and go as they pleased in the afterlife. The spells in this book, like the pyramid text and the coffin text, primarily serve to provision and protect the deceased. Essentially, the spells are designed to ward off the evil forces that the deceased encounter once they died and head off to the afterlife. The spells are there so that they can pass by the obstacles and find their way to Osiris. This was the ultimate goal for the deceased, to reach Osiris. If you could not do so, then you could not have eternal life. Everything that you see the Egyptians doing regarding death most likely is there because of Osiris. The last source that we have that shows that Osiris was once a human king was the burial chamber Dr. Zawi Hawass discovered. Thinking back to the myth of Osiris, do you really think that if such a story were not even at least somewhat true, would you say having a specific tomb buried nearly 100 feet underground with no body in it means something? Now let's take a look at what this actually looks like.
But there is great adventure in archaeology. خلاص وقفوا بقى وارجعوا هناك.
So we're 100 feet down now. What is this?
Susie, this is the tomb of Osiris.
The god of the underworld. This once extravagant mausoleum, a moat with 4 pillars engraved with hieroglyphics constructed thousands of years ago, was intended to be a symbolic shrine for the keeper of the afterlife.
If you will look down here, I will show you what is here. Look, there is the second part of the sarcophagus. Goes down, I think about 1 feet down. And up, you see what we did. The lid is up. You want to see the length of that lid? Okay, let us watch out. Let us see.
How much would something like this weigh?
Oh, the weight of this was 11 to 12 tons. What's the length?
Just about 9 feet.
9 feet. Then the whole lid and the second part is about 11 to 12 tons weight.
And how could they get 12 tons down 100 feet?
You know, when they cut the shaft, they fill the shaft with sand, and they cut side shafts. They take the sand from the side shafts, and the sarcophagus will come down piece by piece.
And there's more. Archaeologists agree that below the Giza Plateau lies a network of tunnels. Could this be the center? A gateway? Our first evidence is stunningly revealed.
Unfortunately, after investigating this tomb shaft, Wasp finds out that it's not really the tomb of Osiris. Located inside this tomb shaft, he found a sarcophagus that was centered in the middle of 4 pillars. Inside the sarcophagus were the remains of a skeleton of what he thinks dates back to the 6th dynasty. No evidence was found that provided the purpose of this significant shaft, or if it even ever was used as a royal burial site. The Wasp believes it was intended as a symbolic tomb for Osiris. There are many tunnels that seem to close in and do not allow entrance. It appears as if the setup of the pillars allowed water to fill the area, leaving the sarcophagus on an island of dry earth. The water would represent the waters of Nun, which covered the world at the time of creation, with the island representing the first mound of earth to emerge. The surrounding water would symbolize the connection Osiris had with rebirth and fertility. The specific placement of the 4 pillars could possibly represent the 4 sacred legs of the god himself as described in later pyramid texts. The Wasp believes that this chamber was for Osiris, that it was a symbolic tomb for him, not as a royal tomb like some references have talked about. This tomb was most likely used for ritual purposes. No other king or god has a tomb built for them without them actually being inside, so this is a very unusual find. Discovering that Osiris may have had a tomb built just to symbolize him tells us a great deal about how important Osiris really was to the ancient Egyptians. Tombs were only built for people who were actually alive, and then died and were placed inside the tomb. Knowing this, it had to have been the case that Osiris was a human being. His body would not be inside this tomb, though, because like the myth states, his brother furiously cut him up into 14 different pieces and scattered them all over Egypt. So there would obviously not be a full body in this tomb. This would confirm that the cutting up of Osiris depicted in the myth is plausible. Having only part of the skeleton inside this tomb makes sense according to the myth of Osiris. As you can see through all of the evidence provided here, it is clear that Osiris was indeed a human being at one point in time. Even though we may not have a specific date as to when this was, it still is safe to say that he was a real man on Earth. There is no historical evidence that has disproved this statement. Archaeologists have been searching through Egypt's sands for hundreds of years, and until just recently, it was discovered that the man who is known as the god of the underworld held an earthly presence. This has been discovered by investigating the Book of the Dead, the narrative of Plutarch, and funerary and coffin texts. Besides what the books and texts say, we have found a 3-story tomb shaft for Osiris consisting of at least 7 chambers. If that doesn't prove that Osiris was real, then nothing will.